Welcome, everybody, to this very special edition of Talk More Talk, a solo Beatles videocast, where we talk about all things from the solo years and, of course, just occasionally things from the Beatles years as well. As you can see, we are joined by some very special guests today. And as you can also see, we're not live tonight, but for a very good reason. And we are just so excited for this show tonight. I think it's going to be a great one. Before we introduce our guests tonight, I'm Kit O'Toole. You probably know me from my book, Songs We're Singing, Guided Tours to the Beatles' Lesser Known Tracks, Michael Jackson FAQ, All That's Left to Know About the King of Pop, and the book I co-edited with our good friend Ken Womack, Fandom and the Beatles, the act you've known for all these years. And let me introduce my good friends that I'm so lucky to co-host this show with every other week. Tom Hunyadi, who is the co-host of the very popular Two Legs, a Paul McCartney-centric videocast and podcast. Joe Mayo, who is the host of the equally popular YouTube channel Mean Mr. Mayo, which is about all things collecting, Beatles-centric mainly, but sometimes other things as well, and humor, Fab Gab show, which is about all things Beatles as well, and of course, last but definitely not least, Ken Michaels, a mainstay in the Beatles community who also never sleeps because he has so many shows. Things We Said Today, who he co-hosts with, among others, one of our guests today, as well as the long-running syndicated show, Every Little Thing, where he plays just that, every little thing from the Beatles and solo years. And if that weren't enough, in addition to this show, he also has his own YouTube channel where he interviews everybody from musicians to authors to podcasters, videocasters. You never know who will show up on his channel. So without further ado, let me introduce our very special guests. They are the authors of this incredible book that everybody is still talking about, and for very good reason, The McCartney Legacy. And this is just volume 1 from 1969 to 1973. I'll tell you, I'm just so excited to be talking about this book today. I think we all are. First, Allan Kozinn, who really doesn't need an introduction. I think everybody knows who he is. He was a music critic and culture reporter for the New York Times from 1977 to 2014. What a run! Where he wrote principally about classical music, but was also basically the Beatles expert. Now writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, many other publications. We subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, and every time I see him, I'm like, I know that guy. And has written for countless other publications. And if that weren't enough, has written tons of books on the Beatles, such as The Beatles from the Cavern to the Rooftop, Got That Something, How the Beatles I Want to Hold Your Hand Changed Everything, and countless other books. And last but definitely not least, once again, Adrian Sinclair, who is the principal investigator for the McCartney Legacy. I cannot wait to talk to you about that. My goodness, what research went into this. And he has worked for pretty much every major broadcaster in the world, including BBC, ITV, Sky, Channel 4, National Geographic, Discovery, and MTV, and has gained recognition for his work with the Royal Television Society in England, and his 2010 documentary Stealing Shakespeare was Emmy nominated for Best Documentary. I mean, I could go on and on for all of their qualifications for this book, and we'd never get to the to the questions. So I think it's safe to say they are more than qualified to write this book. So Allan, Adrian, welcome to Talk More Talk.
Glad to be here.
Thanks for having us on. After that introduction, I think we're out of time now, aren't we?
Yeah, I know. And I had to edit. I had to edit some of that down.
See you next time, guys.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Well, before we get to talking about this incredible book, Ken, you have some news for us. So take it away.
Well,
no pun intended.
Since we just did a show 1 week ago, there hasn't been that much news. But I do have to mention the passing. Actually, the news broke while we did our last show. The passing of Louise Harrison, George Harrison's sister, who died on January the 30th at the age of 91. Louise moved to the United States in the 50s, and her first husband was an engineer for a string of coal companies. They eventually ended up living in Benton, Illinois. And as many Beatle fans will know, George, along with his brother Peter, came to the U.S. in 1963 to visit their sister in Benton. And George actually jammed with a local band called the Four Vests. This was at the El Dorado VFW. And George also went to his first drive-in movie theater at that time, and he bought a Rickenbacker guitar while he was in town. Louise was always busy promoting the Beatles and trying to get local stations to play them. She got one radio station in Illinois to play their latest single at the time, From Me to You. And a few months later, the Beatles arrived in New York, played the Ed Sullivan Show, and then the group exploded in the US and worldwide. And Louise released an album in 1964 on a small record label, Recar, R-E-C-A-R, Recar Records, based out of Minneapolis, called All About the Beatles. Louise had struggles with her personal life, and her marriage ended in divorce. She moved from Benton to Missouri at one point in Connecticut, and eventually landing in Florida. Louise released her own autobiography in 2014, My Kid Brothers Band, aka the Beatles, and she also managed a Beatles tribute band and a British invasion group, Beatles Invasion Band, Liverpool Legends. She died while in an assisted living facility in Florida. George was the youngest of four children, George was, and he had the one sister, Louise, and two brothers, Peter and Harry. Harry is still alive. He's 89 years old. And also, Louise was a guest at the Fest for Beatle fans. Many fans were delighted to meet her in person recently. Seems like in the past 2 weeks, we've had some major news stories concerning Paul McCartney, following the news that there will be a book of photos taken by Paul from late 1963 and early 1964 of the Beatles called 1964 Eye of the Storm, coming out June the 13th. 2 days ago, we heard that there'll be a documentary on Paul's life after the Beatles in the works to be called, at least this is the working title, Man on the Run. And Oscar-winning filmmaker Morgan Neville will be working on it. This will be a joint collaboration between Paul's company, MPL Communications, and Polygram Entertainment, the film and TV division of UMG, the Universal Music Group. This documentary will feature never-before-seen material and new interviews. It's being described as the definitive document of Paul's emergence from the dissolution of the world's biggest band and his triumphant creation of a second decade of musical milestones, a brilliant and prolific stretch. Neville won an Oscar for the film 20 Feet from Stardom, 20 Feet from Stardom, and also worked on the documentary Roadrunner, a film about Anthony Bourdain, as well as the recent Tom Hanks film on Mr. Rogers, Won't You Be My Neighbor. Neville is a self-proclaimed Beatle fanatic and McCartney obsessive, and he says, I was too young to buy Beatle records when they came out, but I could buy Wings records, and I loved them. To me, the story of what happened to Paul in the wake of the Beatles when he had to rediscover himself is the story that has never been told. End of quote. Apparently, he hasn't read the book that we're about to discuss on the show.
Or the book that the working title's for.
Yeah.
There's one thing I'm a little confused about, because in the last couple of years, we heard that there was a documentary in the works all about Paul's solo career that was going to take you all the way up to his appearance in Glastonbury.
Yep.
So I don't know if this was the start of it. I don't know if this has anything to do with it, but it's interesting that this is a brand new project, apparently about just the first decade.
I don't think so, because that was going to be done by Charlie Lightning, I think his name was.
Okay.
Yeah, the career spanning documentary is I think the juicier of the two, to be honest with you, because I mean, with Wingspan and with Tom's and with McCartney Legacy, and even Luca's book. I mean, I just don't understand that quote from him. It says this is an under-examined part of his story. I don't understand that one bit. So,
well, maybe more in depth is what.
Well, we're not getting any more in depth than
the book. More in depth than the new book.
Pretty in depth.
Right. That's why I was saying that. But yeah, there is something to be said about, would you rather have a career spanning documentary where a lot of stuff is lightly touched upon, or would you rather focus on one period where you can go more in depth?
Yeah.
So
I think it would make a great film someday, a motion picture, just that period, the breakup with the Beatles and then reinventing himself and struggling and forming the new band and then becoming, really like worldwide big again, matching it almost with the Beatles and culminating in maybe ending at the Wings Over America tour, just as a movie.
Well, the Amazon Prime, you can watch I think it was a 5 or 6 episode series of the Grateful Dead, and I think McCartney is more popular than or has more fans than them. I think I would love to see this and or the career spanning be a maybe a 10 episode series.
Well, it needs that much time.
Yeah, exactly.
Definitely. Yeah.
But then again, us hardcore fans kind of get pushed to the side sometimes when it comes to these projects.
Yeah.
Yeah. They're not thinking of us as much as the general public.
So that's it. As I said, it's a short newscast.
Hey, all right. Thank you. Thank you, Ken. So as I mentioned at the top, the main topic of this special episode, this bonus episode, is the McCartney legacy. And Adrian, Allan, I am absolutely blown away by this book. I got so involved one night reading this. I kid you not. I was reading it, and then I looked at the clock, and it was 3 a.m.
Wow.
And it was okay. I was tired the next day, and I didn't care, because it was because was that absorbing. I mean, you really did an amazing job. It is just it is just so engrossing. You really captured such a multi-dimensional picture of Paul and his artistic process, what he was going through after the breakup, and really just trying to rebuild his career and trying to establish himself as a new artist. And you really managed to tell his story in a new way, and really reveal his, as I said, his creative process. So bravo. I love this book.
That's what we were aiming for.
Yeah, well, you did it. You absolutely did it. And so before we get to questions we have about some specifics, I thought it might be good to just start out with, for those who haven't read the book yet, may not know as much about the approach that you took. I thought maybe we should start with that. And you mentioned both of you mentioned in the book about how you came up with the concept, and I believe Adrian, you said was that you approached Allan, that you said originally back in 2014, which it's amazing it's been in the works that long, that you originally envisioned it as being kind of a a bit modeled after the Mark Lewison's complete recording sessions, and boy, did it turn into something different. It is a bit like that in parts, but it turned into something else. So how did it go from that to what it became? So Adrian, why don't we start with your initial concept and go from there?
Sure. I mean, we've all read Mark's book, The Complete Recording Sessions, and there's something to be said about flicking through that book, because you start to get a deeper understanding of how the Beatles music was crafted. So I quite like the idea of doing something similar about Paul's solo music, which is kind of lesser documented. Around that time, Luca's book probably was the most in-depth exploration of Paul's studio sessions, and we wanted to go one step further and do it chronologically. So yeah, being somebody who works in television by trade, I wanted to work with somebody who was an accomplished writer, and the man in the corner of the screen there, I couldn't have asked for a better partner, really. And yeah, that really the project just kind of snowballed. And what happened was we ended up with so much information, and we thought, well, what do we do with all this information? Do we discard some of it and just focus the book the way we were going to, or do we present it all and tell the full story? And so we decided to go down that route. The other thing, we've said this a few times in interviews, is that really to understand Paul's story and his creative process and his life more, you need to see both sides of the story. His what's going on outside of the studio and what's going on inside the studio, or what's going on the road, or whatever's going on in Paul's life. And I think when you tell the stories side by side, in a narrative form, without any foreknowledge, as Mark did with Tune In, you end up with a bit of a ripping yarn. It's just a great narrative. You've got all these incredible stories that start presenting themselves that maybe you weren't aware of before, and events that you start linking together that you hadn't associated with one another before. I mean, the classic example is the release of Another Day. And when we started piecing together the timeline, and we saw that the release date was, I think it's something like the 14th of February, 71. And we realized that was the first day Paul was due in court for the beginning of the Beatles case, when he sued the other Beatles to dissolve their Apple partnership. So Paul in the charts has his song, It's Just Another Day, when he's appearing in court suing the other Beatles. So, and you'll find throughout the book, there are so many occasions where those stories start to present themselves. And like I said, you end up with a far more fascinating read than just telling the story of the studio sessions in isolation. So that's where we ended up with that huge book that you've all got on your hands right now.
Absolutely. It's just a fascinating read. And that's, I think, what really is its strength is how you tie in both the personal and the professional. Because you're right. It really, the two tie in so closely together. And Alan, you talk about in your introduction about how you did not interview Paul for the book. Not surprisingly, you note that he doesn't exactly love to work with biographers, and that's not very surprising. How do you think that did that present any kind of challenges writing the book? Do you think it would have changed anything if you had talked with Paul, or how do you think that affected the book, or did it?
I think there are certain things that might have been a little easier if we could just send him an email, or have some time with him at various points during the writing, because questions come up no matter how much you research it. Something will come up, like in our case. In one case was who paid for the recording sessions for Ram, because we run into this section where Len Wood from EMI turns up, and he's awfully alarmed at how much he thinks Paul is spending. Hasn't seen any bills yet. But he knows he's been recording in New York. Paul has said when he was in London to talk to one of his lawyers, he told the press that he was on his way to Paris for more sessions, which wasn't even true. But Len Wood read that and assumed, okay, he's recording in New York, he's recording in Paris, now he's recording in LA. What's this going to cost? And we began thinking, okay, well, if EMI was so concerned about this and they didn't want to pay it, and pretty sure the Eastmans didn't pay it, and Paul wasn't going to be paying it out of pocket, how did this get paid for? And it took us a lot of reasoning of, okay, what is the situation? Where are all of the Beatles expenses going, which was Apple, and and we had to sort of piece that together. But if we could have just got Paul on the phone or on email, we could have just asked and he could have just answered, and it would have saved us many hours of working on this. But actually the process itself was so much fun, and so interesting that even without that, it didn't matter. The thing is that we have a huge archive of Paul McCartney interviews, lots of other people involved interviews. And in Paul's case, I think we have so many things on video and audio and in print that we pretty much have his answers for most of the things that we would ask, except for things like who paid for RAM, which, so we kind of know what he has to say. And also his memory is changing, like everyone's does, all of ours do. He looks back now and he says, yeah, Jet, right, that was I got the name from a pony we had. But if you go back to the 1973 interviews, you find out that it was a puppy and the pony didn't come till later. Things like that. So our feeling was that interviews from as close to the time as possible are most likely the most reliable. It's not always the case. Sometimes right at the time of the event, you might be making up a story about something else. For instance, if you read some of the interviews that people in Paul's circle were doing at the time of Wildlife, you would get the impression that Mumbo was recorded live in the studio, and that everything on Wildlife was a first take. Tony Clark said that, Paul said it, and that was right at the time too. So even with interviews at the time, you have to be careful. But we have the whole, run of interviews from 1969, well, and earlier, really, all the way through to today. We're still collecting them. So so that was how we dealt with the fact that he wasn't speaking to us specifically for the book.
Wow.
I'm just going to add, I think the one thing it did give us though was objectivity. That we could also present the story from other people's perspectives. So you get to hear voices in there, talking about certain things that maybe you wouldn't have heard if we'd have made the book with Paul. It would have been more about Paul's story, and those voices might not even have appeared at all. So I suppose that's the one advantage it did give us, was that we could speak to all these different people and tell you all these wonderful stories about, all these different things that happened during that 5-year period.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the book's many strengths, is you present so many different perspectives, so you really get a full picture. And just one more question before I pass it on to my colleagues. I know they've got questions, but one thing that you both touched on here is the research, and I'll tell you, the massive amount of research that went into this is so impressive. How long did it take you, and how did you do this? I mean, how did you go through just all the archives and the interviews? I mean, how did you break this up? I mean, how did you accomplish this? I guess this is to both of you, as I know you both went into, both did this.
Yeah, well, it's funny. Someone commented on Twitter, I think it was yesterday. We said that the book was 8 years in the making, but really it was 16 years in the making, because there's two of us. you know, because we can do the work of 2 people, you know, over that period of time. So it had 16 years worth of work going into it, really. But yeah, in terms of the division, you know, I was the principal researcher, but really, as Alan was writing, he was also researching. You know, so everything you read is based on, you know, a timeline that I put together, which is full of all the dates and details and information. But then as Alan's writing it, you know, he starts to think, well, you know, we're talking about Love is Strange, for example. And, you know, Alan will look at every version of Love is Strange that was recorded. And, you know, so we can add that as a footnote. You know, I mean, when you go down those kind of little rabbit holes, you know, they can take you to all kinds of weird and wonderful places. But yeah, it was a lot of work. And the second book, which we're working on now at the moment, is equally, if not more, work. You know, we've got so much stuff for this second book. It's perplexing right now, isn't it, Alan? It's kind of making our brains explode. Yeah.
And just last week, the British Library sent Adrian a bill for back rent for the last 8 years.
Oh, you did a book. Well, here you go.
Yeah, and a lot of it's probably just good old-fashioned detective work. I mean,
yeah, I mean,
like,
I'm really fortunate. You know, I moved to where I live now, and I had no idea that the British Library have their kind of warehouse facilities just down the road from here. And I didn't know that when I moved here. So when we started researching this book, and I thought I'd like to go to the British Library, I thought I'd be traveling on a train to London, which is 2 hours away. And instead I'm traveling 10 minutes down the road. So I suppose that's how maybe we managed to accomplish so much in a short space of time, in that I can be in the library in 10 minutes and work till they close and then come home. You know, so we really did an awful lot of research. The British Library, for anybody writing a book about popular music, is just the most invaluable resource. You know, not only the music press, but you know, as I said, you start to go down other rabbit holes when you start to look at regional stories. You know, so the university tour and the British tour. We did a lot of research in the local newspapers to see if the band appeared. And of course, when Paul McCartney's in town, Paul McCartney is in the local newspaper. And you'll find thousands of those details in the book that we pluck from news reports all over the country and all over the world, in fact, you know, because we're then talking Lagos, Jamaica. For every holiday they went on, obviously, we had to look at the newspapers. And yeah, and it just goes on. But you end up with all these pieces that you put together, and you can tell the story in Technicolor. And that was really our aim from the start.
you did it. I love the story in Technicolor. That's exactly what it is. That is really true. All right, let me pass it to Tom. Tom, what questions do you have?
Well, first, let me just say that this book is my favorite meal of all time, and every page is another bite, and I just can't wait for that next bite. This was, like Kid says, you know, you're reading it, next thing you know, it's 4 days later, you know, and you're still reading.
Yeah.
But you know, when you guys were on my other show, we touched a little bit upon the timeline thing, you know, especially for Band on the Run. And we know the events that happened. We know, you know, quite a few. We know that he, you know, recorded at Ginger's place. We know that the tapes were stolen. We know the run-in that he had with Fela Kuti. You know, talk about putting those events in order, because we knew of those events. We really didn't know when they happened in the timeline. You guys actually were able to do that and talk about coming to the conclusion that this was as accurate as possible.
Well, I suppose the most pivotal events that happened during that time were Paul going to see Fela in concert. Mm-hmm. Fela then accusing him of stealing the black man's music. Paul collapsing. Paul being held at knife point with Linda. I suppose those are the major ones, aren't they? Really, those four. And really finding out when those events took place was the most important thing with regards to the Lagos timeline. Mm-hmm. And yeah, we found the date for the Fella concert through a concert poster that was in the Lagos press. And then we discovered that the day afterwards, Fella had been down to the studios because he then appeared on the BBC World Service and Nigerian radio and made the newspapers the day after. So we then could put those events in line. We were given the date of Paul and Linda being held at knife point from an internal MPL timeline that was published in 1976. So we can nail that down definitively. What's the last one I'm missing here? Paul passing out, yeah, and I think that was just that one. I don't think we were actually given, you know, a document that had that date on it. It was just a case of when we told the story and we found all the accounts of that story, we then knew when that event happened. So yeah, what we ended up with was a timeline which showed them in Nigeria for 2 weeks recording, keeping themselves to themselves more or less, and just kind of getting on with recording. Spending their weekends hanging out with, you know, local tribal leaders and the local country club, swimming, and playing pranks on Jeff Emerick, stuff like that, you know. and then basically it started to unravel. You know, the second that they went to that concert, the whole visit began to unravel, and you know, they ended up back in London. What was it, 5 or 6 days later? So like you said, you know, we all knew those events happened, but we didn't know in which order they happened. But when you tell that story in the correct order, you start to understand the story dramatically, and the reasons behind why certain choices were made. But yeah, that was, I mean, that was the culmination of, I don't know how many years worth of trying to find those pieces, really. That last date came in for Linda and Paul being held at knife point really late in the day, and it was a game changer, really, being able to place when that was.
Yeah, because you know the way we may understand it is that we feel that happened at the beginning of those sessions rather than towards the end. So again, I mean, great job of putting all the pieces together in this book and making it, you know, painting that picture as accurate as possible. So great job, guys, on that. We know that Paul was invited for the concert of George. I never knew that he was invited for the One in the One concert. Can you talk about, you know, how finding that out and who actually invited him for that, to that? And it was just, I think it was Paul and Wings that were invited. I
mean, I think John did. Adrian, how did we come up with that?
Well, I mean, that was just something that was mentioned by John in an interview. Yeah. And this is the thing, when you spend months and months in the library and you read every copy of every music paper for that period, which is what I did, you know. So I would have read through Melody Maker, Disc, Sounds, NME, and Record Mirror, as well as a lot of other magazines as well that were published, you know, like some of the teen mags. They often ran stories with members of the Beatles, and we read every interview with every member of the Beatles for that period as well, and we clipped everything that they were doing, because that was quite important to our story, knowing where the other Beatles were and what they were up to. And that was just something that was mentioned by John during an interview. He said that he'd invited Paul along, and yeah, we decided to you know, expand that in the book and give a little bit more detail about how that concert came about. And you know, even researching that one-to-one concert was really interesting.
Right.
And yeah, when you watch was it Geraldo Rivero, was it, that did the report which led to that? Right. I think it was, wasn't it? Yeah. And we actually even found the original report, and which led to the one-to-one concert, and looked at Rivero's movements around that time. So yeah, it was a really interesting part of the research. But yeah, we didn't know that before we stumbled upon that fact just in an interview. So yeah, a lot of those facts came from interviews with the other Beatles.
Right, because you know, we know that Klein was the big factor for Concert of George, and John is still with Klein for this concert as well. So I would imagine that him not going was probably, you know, kind of towards the same reason as not doing the Bangladesh concert as well.
Anything that Klein would take credit for, which he would have
Right.
done, Paul was against for obvious reasons.
Right.
Mm.
Yeah, interesting stuff. You know, and then you also, you know, pepper in a lot of just little tidbits of Paul's genius right here. Okay, I think he's at the was it No Secret sessions for Carly Simon, and Richard Perry is the producer, and Richard Perry is also working on the Ringo album as well. Here's his opportunity to get Paul involved, right? So it's Saturday, March 24th. And then Paul's like, well, I'll do something if you give me a deadline. He goes, okay, well, how about Wednesday, which is only 4 days later? And he comes up with 6 o'clock, you know, which was arguably the best song that anybody wrote for Ringo, you know, in my opinion. So
Mine especially.
yeah, this is, you know, all
I
these
like
little
I'm the
details.
greatest too.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
no, nothing wrong with that as well. But yeah, just these little details in there is fantastic. But I've got more, but I'll send it off to Joe now.
No, to me.
Yeah, again,
Okay.
Yep.
yeah, again,
So-
I was just going to say, again, we were quite lucky with that Ringo story that we were able to find the date of the session, which we were given by Richard Perry. So, so we knew exactly when that session took place. So we could tell you when that Wednesday was and
Right.
identify when the deadline Paul was then working to. So I think when you can give that level of accuracy with something, it makes the story so much more interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
And also
Agreed.
Richard Perry worked on the James Paul McCartney special briefly. And so it's funny what a small world it is. You know, we were constantly running into connections between all these people that we hadn't quite realized were there. It's very illuminating and continues to be in volume 2.
Yeah. I was just going to say, today I've been looking into something which I still can't find an answer to, which is that a member of the band Chocolate Milk called Kenneth Afro Williams appeared during the Venus and Mars sessions in London. And that band would normally record at Sea Saint Studios, which is where Wings ended up finishing the album off. But nobody can explain why a percussionist from New Orleans just happened to be in the studio with Wings before they went to New Orleans to record. And apparently there was no connection. It was just a coincidence. But it seems like a really big coincidence that a member of a New Orleans band would be in the studio with Wings about 6 weeks before they went to his native studio in New Orleans. So like Alan said, you know, you're constantly finding this kind of interconnection between people, even when you know there's nothing to read into it.
Well, if you just want to forward all the notes that you guys are discovering at the same time,
Yeah.
don't worry about it. We'll, you know, our lips are sealed. But
Okay. All right. Well, first of all, guys, you know, really learned a bunch of things on reading the book, obviously. And I have to tell you that one of the things that I really appreciated was the idea and feeling that Paul was really made human in this. And what I mean by that is different facets to Paul. See, now when we do this show, a lot of times I'm the spice. And it's a lot of sugar, and I'm the spice of it. So I'm going to spice it up a little bit already. You know, with Paul, of course, we get a lot of this and all that kind of stuff in public and all that. And, you know, we learn, of course, more about his positive attitude, work ethic, and all those wonderful things that make him so special and who he is and so professional. But I like that there was some stuff in there, like talking about how difficult it could be sometime working with Paul, like the troubles with Henry McCullough. And even though apparently him leaving led to tears. Oh, we lost Kit. Okay, I'll continue. Led even to tears, even Henry himself, from what I read there. But it's a long-winded question. But yeah, I'm amazed by when I'm hearing about the stuff that we know, like Henry McCullough did such a wonderful lead solo on My Love, and Paul let him do that. And then later on, when they were rehearsing No Words, right? During Band on the Run sessions. He went, let's have to beg Paul, give me a chance, give it a chance if you don't like it. But Paul apparently, in no uncertain terms, was, I won't quote what he, as in the book, but you'll bleep and do it, and that's it. And that's the kind of thing that we don't often hear from Paul. I was kind of surprised by that. And along those lines, I guess other things in the book are like that. But along those lines, I'm wondering, was this a decision that you made? Well, we're not going to hide anything. If something negative is there, we'll do it. Not a situation where, like, say, I think Liberty is saying Philip Norman trying to maybe arguably placate Paul later on in a later book. Did you guys make the decision to kind of just tell it all like it is?
Yeah, that was the idea, to tell it like it is. And if we ran into something that we knew, probably Paul wouldn't tell if it was his own film or book or whatever, we still had to do it if we ran into it, and if it was significant or interesting. I mean, I'm sure there are tons of things that everybody in the book did that other people didn't like, that are just inconsequential, and you don't need to have it in a book 50 years later. But we felt that we did want to give him some texture. We didn't want to make him a saint, and we didn't want to make him a devil. We wanted to just show Paul as he is and what he's like to work with, and to the degree that we could get the information to do that, which talking to other people and reading whatever there is, and and people, not everybody found him the most easy person to work with, and a lot of people did. So we have a big variety of opinion there. Also about Linda, there are people who found Linda kind of haughty and entitled, and a lot of people who really loved her as a person, may have even said, okay, she wasn't the greatest keyboard player, but she was a great mother, and she was a really warm person to be with, and she would make Thanksgiving dinner for the band, and the whole thing. So we wanted to have as textured a portrait as we possibly could, and that meant putting in as much detail as we could, whatever the detail was. As one of the reviews put it,
Oh,
if the devil is in the details, the McCartney legacy is positively satanic.
oh, wow.
Love
Well, but that's important, not to go all negative. A lot of people say that's my reputation. I'm always going for the downer, but not always. But you mentioned Linda, and
we didn't. The idea was to go negative or positive. I mean, the
Right,
idea that we're doing the book is because we admire him as an artist. So I think with that as the sort of standard median line or whatever, everything else sort of fills out. And we weren't there to hide anything, and we weren't there to whatever.
Well,
And really,
Linda, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, and really, if you look at Band on the Run as the example, that they fell out during the rehearsals for Band on the Run. Paul and Henry locked horns during the rehearsals for no words. Henry closed his guitar case and walked. It was kind of Paul's, I don't know, slightly overbearing nature during those rehearsals that led to that happening. So that's the negative. And then his response to that is, we'll show them. And then the positive of all of it is that you end up with Band on the Run. So really, we showed the cause and effect. The cause being Henry leaves the band because Paul was overbearing, and the effect is you end up with this amazing album. So without one, you can't have the other, can you? So I think that's the importance, like Alan said, of presenting the whole story. Warts and all.
Mm.
Yeah, and how triumphant that album was, and if that wasn't, a positive kind of like that, that'll show you a kind of vengeance, so to speak, not deliberate vengeance, but you had to feel good about that. But I just wanted to mention quickly, Linda. Look, I met Linda and she's wonderful. Everybody loves Linda. She's a sweetheart, and she's really a very down to earth kind of person. That's why, again, I was so shocked during that story to read that when the time came when Henry finally told Paul he wasn't going to go to Lagos, and the phone conversation, and there was a hang up. Linda called back and said, "How dare you inconvenience us?" I
Yeah.
just couldn't imagine that. I could not imagine that happening. So I was like, wow, that's an interesting reveal.
Another thing that comes through is that Linda really was fiercely, and that I choose that word, deliberately, fiercely protective of Paul, and fiercely supportive of whatever it is he wanted to do. She may have had, private issues with this or that, but if this is what he wanted to do, then she was there, and she was going to be the angry den mother calling up the other guy and saying, "How dare you inconvenience us?" Paul, I don't think would have done that, but Linda, and I think that Linda was also, she had a relationship with Denny as well. Paul and Linda were both very close to the Sywells, and maybe she felt that she could convince him even if Paul couldn't, whatever it was. Linda, I think Linda in this book comes off again with more texture than she usually gets. We have many different sides of her, including the very sort of realist Linda that keeps coming out, where someone will come to her and say, "Well, is Paul a really, good supportive piano teacher?" And she'll say, "Absolutely not. He has no patience for someone who doesn't already know." She doesn't mind saying, what the truth is from her point of view. But if someone is going against what Paul wants to do, she's gonna be there, like a mother lion,
Which is as it should be, really, And I apologize if I made an error. I think I might have said Henry on the phone. I meant Denny at that point. But okay, just let me ask a question. I'm swinging it around to something kind of positive, I hope. The Wings 1972 over Europe tour. Now, they were asked to rehearse some Beatles songs, and I think they had done Long and Winding Road, and yesterday they rehearsed it. They rehearsed them. And can you elaborate on that, and how did Paul feel about Beatles at that time, earlier on at that time?
Yeah, well, I think Paul was asked by probably every promoter in Europe, play some Beatles tunes, because they knew that would bring the crowds out. But for Paul, he always said that it was still, I don't know, the breakup was still a little bit too raw for him around that time. But they did play in the James Paul McCartney TV special. They did play the Long and Winding Road. It just wasn't used. And obviously Paul played some Beatles tunes during his acoustic set of the James Paul McCartney special. So that was really Paul's first step towards, accepting that, the Beatles were no more, but he could still hold on to that kind of material that he'd recorded with them. But yeah, I think that was really the only reason why they didn't take them on tour. He might have said that he wanted the band to have its own identity, but really the band didn't have much material to have an identity in 1972. They were really filling out to try and get the set as long as it was, and it maybe would have helped them out if they played some Beatles songs. But as Alan mentioned earlier on as well, I think the Klein effect probably also played into that at the time. That would playing Beatles tunes in some way, make Klein happy in some way, or I don't know. You got to think I think there was a sort of psychological barrier about the association of his music and Klein that he didn't want to cross that barrier. As soon as Klein was gone, the floodgates were open, and that was it, really.
That's true. All right, lastly, just one more thing I was wondering about. You got access to Denny Sywell's diaries, right? For this, could you tell us about that? How did you get those? And you just offered them up to you?
Yeah, it was that simple. Yeah.
You didn't steal them, right? You didn't go in there.
Yeah, no, it was really wild. Was that
Oops. Audio.
We lost your audio, Adrian.
Yeah.
I can tell it while he's fiddling with his
Okay.
audio.
All right.
Adrian, we interviewed Denny maybe 4 or 5 times, and I interviewed him first, and then Adrian wanted to follow up, and Adrian did a phone interview with him, and it was on Halloween. So while he's sort of dealing with trick-or-treaters, he's talking to Denny at the same time. And while this is going on, Denny says, you know, by the way, I kept these logs of my sessions, and my wife kept a diary, you know, just about, you know, what we did and where and when and all that. Would those things interest you? One of the great questions, you know. So and yeah, they did interest us a great deal.
A little bit.
So back, Adrian.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Go.
Yeah,
Yes.
but yeah, no, it really was that simple. It was a case of, you know, would you like to read what's in these diaries, and that was it. Yeah.
You can't get more official and specific than that for writing a book, right? Okay, well, Ken, I'll hand it over to you, Ken.
All right, thanks, Joe. And I want to repeat what all of you have been saying to thank you for this book, because I think more than anything, it really helps to explain how complex a person Paul McCartney could be. We all are. And with all he had going on in his life, those first few years after the Beatle breakup, you really explain it so well. But I want to tell you guys that I feel very privileged that I've had the chance to interview a lot of members of Wings going into this book. I've interviewed Denny Seiwell a number of times, Henry McCullough I've interviewed, Lawrence Juber, Steve Holley, and Denny Lane. And depending upon who you talk to, certainly Denny Seiwell and Lawrence Juber will give you the impression that Wings was very much a band, and they weren't sidemen to Paul. And Henry, I don't think would have said that. But I know in the case of, because you go into Red Rose Speedway and how it went from being a double album to a single album. You said that Wings had very little input in picking the material on the single album, and Denny Seiwell has told me a few times that they all were involved with picking the songs. And in addition to that, and I want to thank you for clarifying something here, because it was my impression that Red Rose Speedway became a single album more because Wildlife didn't do that well. But it had to do more, I guess, with Capitol Records realizing the Red and the Blue collections were coming out, and there'd be too much Beatle product. And also George Harrison had Living in the Material World coming out the next month. So that's why it was trimmed to a single album. Even though Yoko Ono had a double album out in January, I guess that had nothing to do with it. But can you explain, you know, the information that you got about Red Rose Speedway, how it was trimmed down to a single album? Because according to what Denny Seiwell has told me, they were all involved with it. And the main concern that they had was that the songs would flow together well and sequence well. And that's why they picked the songs that they did. And just one more thing, because in your book, I think you said that EMI didn't want the other members' songs. They didn't want Denny Lane songs. They didn't want Linda McCartney on lead vocals. So that also explained why those songs were eliminated.
Yeah, no.
I think it was too much.
I mean, again, as Alan touched on earlier in our chat, you go back to the very earliest interviews, and the first person to speak about the trimming to a single album, I think, was Henry at the time. And he said that it wasn't their decision. They had nothing to do with it. And then I think we traced every band member's reaction to the trimming of the single album as close to the event as possible. Yeah, it was Denny Lane who said that EMI didn't want other members of the group, you know, singing lead vocals. That was basically something Denny Lane had said, which makes perfect sense really when you see the final track list. So yeah, it was just a case of looking at the information that we had and looking at all of the interviews that we had as close to the period as possible that weren't, you know, people looking back and reflecting on it, although maybe some of them were a little bit further away from the event, in order to tell the true story of what happened there. And I think we also had an interview with Paul's manager, Vincent Romeo, from around 1976, where he talked about the trimming to a single album. So again, he kind of confirmed the story. That was a decision that was made for commercial reasons. It was a case of what would be a more commercial album, a collection of cuts by all different members of Wings, or a very commercial pop album, which is what it became, with all the lead vocals sung by Paul. And really, that's what EMI and Capitol wanted, and that's what they ended up releasing. But it would have been a much, much better album if they'd issued the double LP. And I think people would probably look back at that as a classic if it had been issued as a double LP, because it was a great showcase for the band. Every member of the band had a solo spot really on that double LP. I was relieved when they reissued it as part of the archive series a few years back.
Yeah, well, I'm just going by what Denny Seiwell has always told me. And he's one of them. He must know.
Yeah, it's interesting because you have these conversations and you'll talk to 5 people that were in the room, and you get 4 different stories. And 2 of them confirm the same thing. And then you look at all of the paperwork and press and things relating to a certain subject, and you eventually kind of settle it down to the truth, or as close to the truth as you're going to get 50 years on. But yeah, I'm sure that every person that was in that room will tell you a different story of why that was cut down to a single LP.
Right.
But it does illustrate in the book how Paul really wanted Wings to be established as a real band. He even say that he wanted every member, for the public to know their first names the same way that they knew John, Paul, George, and Ringo. And the fact that he wanted it to be a double album with Denny Lane songs and Linda McCartney songs like Seaside Woman. And also even early on in concert, Henry got his instrumental song in there, and Denny Lane got I Would Only Smile and Say You Don't Mind. So yeah, but you also say that once he finished Band on the Run, he was thinking about how he wanted Wings to be, a democracy, everybody equal and everything. But since he had to deal with both Denny Seiwell and Henry McCullough leaving, he had a different change of mind after that. That he didn't look at the band the same way. Can you explain what you mean about that? Did he just think, well, I proved myself without Henry and Denny there, with just the 3 of us, because he did go on to, you look at the Wings Over America tour, Denny Lane got 5 songs to sing. Jimmy McCulloch got 1 song in there. Wings at the Speed of Sound, everybody has a lead vocal. So he was thinking about Wings still as a band, at least in my mind.
I think he was conflicted about that in a way. I mean, from the very start, when Denny Seiwell turned up and they are talking about forming Wings, Paul is saying, according to Denny, this will be an equal partnership. Everybody will be an owner of this band, I think is the phrase that Denny quoted him saying. Everybody will have a share in it and will split the proceeds and all of that stuff. But the circumstances made that really difficult to put into effect. And then as you go on, you begin to see the other aspect of the is it Paul or is it a band story, which is when they're working on the material, does everybody in the band get an equal input? And we run into, those 2 stories of, No Words and My Love, where in both cases, Henry basically has to beg to play his own guitar solo. And in one case, he is given a yes, and in one case, he's given a no. But the impression you get from listening to Henry is all through this was sort of an issue. And it had to have been kind of puzzling for Henry. Why would you hire me? You know, I'm known as a blues guitarist who plays solos and, you know, and is a creative player. Why would you hire me just to be the, you know, third violinist in the eighth row of the New York Philharmonic fundamentally? You know, just play what's on the page in front of you or what I've, you know, whispered in your ear. That really bothered him. And from his point of view, that isn't being a band. That's being just told what to do, you know, by the leader, you know. And then, you know, just to be realistic, everybody was coming to see Paul. You know, if they went on tour, who's selling the tickets, really? You know, and that wasn't lost on Paul, and it wasn't lost on all of them. And so it's a very difficult balancing act, because part of him really wanted it to be a band, because especially early on, he had just come out of the Beatles. The Beatles was a band. That's what he wanted again. He, you know, but it's not like you're going to get that again if you were a Beatle and everybody else in your band wasn't, you know. And not only wasn't, but it's not like the band was a band of everybody was a superstar. Really, just Paul was a superstar in that band. You know, some people who followed Joe Cocker, et cetera, knew Henry. People knew Denny Lane from the early Moody Blues. People sort of knew them, but they weren't on Paul's level of magnitude. So it's hard to have a real band if you have one absolute star. You know, no matter how good everybody else is. You know, look at his current band; they're really good. They can do anything in his catalog, note perfect, but people don't go to see them, they go to see Paul.
Well, you know, how we all define what a band is could be different from everybody.
Sure.
Because to me, it comes down more to collaboration and how much there is. And based on what I've heard from different members of Wings, is that Paul would be willing to accept an idea of yours if he liked it, and he would put it in the song. But there were times when he knew exactly what he wanted, and he wanted you to play it that way. So it worked both ways in the band. But there were times when, like, you know, My Love, he loved the solo on that, but he wanted Henry to play it the same way every time. So
yeah, I think, like you say, Ken, that's fundamentally what it comes down to, is if he liked what he was hearing,
right,
then great. But if he didn't like what he was hearing, then he would tweak it. You know, if you look at the entry for Give Ireland Back to the Irish, you see, you know, Henry starts off that song with a 12-note wailing guitar solo, and then that's whittled down to 6, and then it's whittled down to 4, or whatever it ends up being on the record. And that was all chronicled by a journalist who was sitting in on the session. So you got a real insight to how that process between Henry and Paul worked very early on. And I think that continued. You know, if they were playing a song in the studio and Henry came up with something that Paul liked, I'm sure it went on the record. And that's why we ended up with probably so many of those jams that were recorded during that period of Red Rose Speedway. That some of them, you know, were intended for the double LP, like Night Out and things like that. But fundamentally, when it came to, you know, the pop songs, Paul really had an idea of what he wanted it to be, you know, and that rippled through everything. It ripples through to the guys playing recorders, you know, the Dolmetsch family playing recorders on the Wildlife album. You know, Paul told them every note he wanted them to play on the piano, and they just played it back in harmony. You know, so it kind of, like I said, it ripples through the whole process, and you see that kind of quite frequently. So I suppose the more you start to see that pattern of behavior, the more you probably think that that's something that happened a lot during their time in the studio, and either you accepted it as part of being in the band and collaborating, or you didn't, in Henry's case, and you walk. But I think fundamentally Paul's relationship with his sideman evolved over the years as well, you know, and certainly you'll see a lot of that in the second book. You know, Paul spends a lot of time in Nashville trying to get his head around what the next incarnation of Wings is going to be, and how it's going to work. Will they have contracts? Will they not have contracts? You know, how will it work artistically? How will it work when they go on tour? You know, and there's a lot of stuff going through his mind. And yeah, we'll, you know, explore a lot of that in the second book.
Yeah,
Like you say, you'll see fundamentally kind of how Paul's idea maybe of Wings and whether or not it was a band evolved over that period of time until Wings was no more.
I just think, you know, there's always this growing room for debate as to whether that Wings was a real band. And, you know, like I said, Wings at the Speed of Sound, every member had a lead vocal. Well, that was Paul's decision. He didn't have to put it out that way. And he could have had the Wings Over America tour be him doing every vocal, just like he does now, but it wasn't in those days.
Well, it raises actually two questions. It's not just whether Wings was a band, it's also whether Paul wanted it to be a band. He wanted it to be a band most of the time. Whether it was a band is a totally different question, you know, and it could change with every recording, you know, whether it was a band or not.
I think the other thing about that point you made about the 76 tour, where all the band had their moment in the spotlight, there were also practical reasons for doing that, because it allowed Paul a break from singing. So I think that it kind of worked both ways for him, to give Denny Lane a few songs and to give Jimmy a song or two. You know, that really meant that he, during a 2 hour 15-minute set, I think it was, wasn't it, that Paul got a couple of breaks in there. So, but yeah, no, I'm absolutely with you. You know, he clearly wanted the band to be a democracy when it came to Speed of Sound. But yeah, whether or not he was willing to embrace that long term, I don't know. I mean, it kind of quickly unraveled in London Town, didn't it? So.
Well, Denny Lane kind of waffles when he gives his assessment about the Wings days, because I know that when the Moody Blues were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, he said that Wings wasn't really a band. But I know that when I interviewed him a while ago, he said that Paul was always encouraging him to write, you know, and he wouldn't have wanted that if he didn't want it to be more of a collaboration. And London Town is the ultimate example of that, because there are about 5 songs that Paul and Denny Lane wrote together.
Yeah, so, I mean, that was their most productive period, really, was London Town. But before then, essentially, Denny, you know, he complained at the end of recording Band on the Run, did Denny, to the music press. He said, "Oh, I just feel like it's a Paul and Linda album," you know, and I didn't really have much of an input. I was just there as a session guy. But then when Paul encouraged him to write songs, you know, did he come forward with, you know, a songbook brimming with all these brilliant ideas that they could use on the next record? Well, no, he didn't. So, you know, I mean, on Venus and Mars, did Denny write anything on Venus and Mars? Was it one song maybe? No, he did a couple of vocals on it. Yeah,
on Spirits of Ancient Egypt, he sang lead vocals on the verse.
That's right.
Verses,
and he wrote a song while they were in Nashville. He wrote "Send Me the Heart," but really he wasn't a productive or prolific songwriter. Was Denny? Right. So I think that's maybe where fundamentally the idea of it being a band, you know, kind of unraveled slightly, was because Paul didn't have someone as prolific as John working alongside him. So it did become Paul McCartney and Wings, because Paul was the man that was writing all of the material.
And yet, at one Beatles convention in Connecticut, I interviewed Denny, and he said Band on the Run was the most enjoyable album that he worked on with Paul. So, like I said, he waffles a bit, so you don't really know what to think. I also wanted to bring up that there was one point where you're talking about when Helen Wheels came out as a single, and Paul was seeing that Ringo had Photograph out at that time, and John had Mind Games out at the time, and he was thinking, oh, I got to top them now. Do you think that Paul was really that competitive with the others? Did it really matter that much to him that he had to perform better with his music? Or was he just, could he possibly have been, despite all the legal problems that he had with the other Beatles, just genuinely happy if the others did well?
I think he was happy if the others did well, but he was also competitive with them. He was competitive with them when he was in the Beatles. You know, So, why wouldn't he be? He was competitive with, and not just them, he wanted to be more successful than any other band, or solo artist, as sort of anyone who does what he does probably would. You don't probably get to be Paul McCartney because just okay is good enough for you. He wanted everything he did to be the most successful. And sometimes that there were odd decisions in there. If you want what you're doing to be the most successful, why are you putting out Mary Had a Little Lamb? I don't know. He had, but when the question came up, brought up by the other members of Wings, he reached for the music papers and he looked at the top 10 and he said, novelty record, novelty record, novelty record. Why is this so different? He has his own internal logic.
Very much so. Hey, Kid is back, I think.
Oh, wait a minute. Let's see if we get her back, because it'll be perfect timing if it works.
Yay. There she is.
Well,
Hey guys.
Hey, Kid, the timing couldn't be better, by the way.
Really?
Just about your turn.
Oh my
Grocery
gosh.
shopping?
Okay.
Grocery shopping?
You went out to buy another copy of the book, right?
Wow, that was good. Yep, it's been interesting. But finally our connection's back up.
Perfect timing.
Excellent. So it's my turn.
I don't mean to cut you off, Ken.
back to
Excuse
you.
me.
Oh,
didn't
go
mean to
right
cut
ahead.
you.
I'm sorry.
No. I'm saying I timed everything so that you just for your return, so that
So
we just
back to you.
my last question for the moment.
Excellent. So sorry about that extended interruption. My goodness. So our power went on and off, and then it took forever for the modem to reboot, and and I'm back.
Can't be helped.
Yep, it's of all days that had to happen. So, but good. I guess that was good timing, sort of. But I hated to miss all the conversation. My goodness.
You'll have to watch the show.
Yes. So my goodness. So okay. Well, I hope I just have a couple of questions, and I hope they haven't been asked already, since I had to miss part of it. But has the question been asked about Paul and his producers? Has that been asked? Oh, good. Okay. So that was one thing that I really enjoyed in the book, was the relationship of between Paul and his the producers he worked with, particularly, of course, on Ram and Red Rose Speedway. And I mean, it was almost funny. Wait, with the producers walking out and everything. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that. Particularly, I love the story about Glenn Johns and Mary Had a Little Lamb.
I think Paul just got his timing wrong when it came to picking producers. So in February 71, when they're recording Ram, Paul wasn't in the greatest, frame of mind to be working with someone else, I don't think, around that time. He was clearly depressed, going through a lot with what was going on back in London with the court action. So when he started working with Jim Guercio, I think there was only ever going to be one outcome there, really. When Paul started arriving to the studio late, and he was smoking heavily, smoking a lot of dope. I think, Jim Guercio obviously has this vision that he's fulfilling this, childhood dream of working with one of the Beatles, his idols, and then that quickly unraveled, within the space of a week or two, wasn't it? I mean, it was really quick. And with the Glyn Johns situation, I just think it was poor timing. I think that Wings went into the studio too early. The material they had probably wasn't strong enough to be the backbone of an album around that time. And they were found out by a producer who wasn't going to stand for any of that, you know. So yeah, like I say, I think fundamentally it was all down to timing. But yeah, poor Glyn Johns, you've got a feel for him, haven't you? That he's there with Paul at the beginning of 1969, and the Beatles are kind of at their creative peak, where Paul is, you know, just riffing and you know, creating songs in the studio, and then he sees the man. It's almost exactly 3 years later, and he was probably just in disbelief, really, at the material that Paul was bringing into the studio. I mean, we've all got, as Wings fans, we've all got affection for those songs that they recorded, When the Night, and, you know, some of those other tunes that were recorded during those Olympic sessions. But let's just say that they're not on the same level as Get Back and The Long and Winding Road and Let It Be, and the stuff that John saw Paul recording with the Beatles, and that we've all seen now through Peter Jackson's documentary. So yeah, you had to feel for Glyn Johns, and really, you know, with a fiery personality. Yeah, again, that was only ever going to end one way, which was with him heading towards the exit. Makes for great drama.
I don't even know why
wonderful.
Paul wants a producer sometimes. I don't even know why Paul is having a producer.
Well, actually, that was my next question. That, you know, at one point, Paul said, and I can't remember if it was which producer it was, when he said, "Oh, I want you to treat me just like the bass player," you know, and then you said, you know, that didn't last for too long, and so you know, how do you know, what do you make of that? You know, what exactly at this point, you know, as we're only talking about this period of time, as you call it, Wings Mark One, you know, what exactly was his relationship with producers in this phase?
I think that he, Jim Guercio wasn't really his idea. It was more John Eastman's idea, and basically it was that John Eastman was sort of looking at Paul working months and months in the studio, recording well more than an album worth of material and not finishing. And he just felt that, you know, maybe having an outside hand to, you know, come in and look at the stuff and sort of guide you towards finishing it off would be a helpful thing. And Paul agreed to that, which is how Guercio got there. And he and he probably, you know, it's like that question about whether he wants Wings to be a band or not, which just before you came in, we had a long discussion of. There are things that he wants ideally, but somehow in practice has a hard time achieving. You know, it's more of a theoretical thing that he wants, but the reality is that it doesn't really work for him, you know. And he, you know, even by the end of the Beatles, there's some question about who's producing and who is, you know, just sort of watching from the second floor of Abbey Road. You know, I don't want to take anything away from George Martin, you know, but if George Martin came up with, you know, these great arrangements, it's because at that point, you know, the end of the Beatles, it's because Paul said, "I want strings on this." You know, it wasn't the normal producer is in charge kind of thing. He was a collaborator with them rather than the boss of the sessions. And that's what Paul was used to. And the idea of having a boss of the sessions imposed on him, even if he's the one imposing it, even if he's the one saying, "Just treat me as the bass player," it just wasn't working for him at that point in his career. You know, later on, I think he was able to work with producers because he'd been through an awful lot more, made an awful lot more music, and began to see producers as another collaborative voice that perhaps could shape the tone of what he was doing, and, you know, and be another influence. But in this volume of the story, it just didn't work, and he wanted it to work. I think he really wanted it to work, or he wouldn't have done it, you know. But just in practice, it just wasn't going to happen.
I
Yeah.
think there might have been, with Glyn Johns, just off the back of the university tour, there might have been an element with Paul there as well of almost trying to recreate what the Beatles did with George Martin. So he's just been on the he's just been on the road with Wings. The university tour was their equivalent of Hamburg and the Cavern Club. So going into the studio with Glyn Johns at the start of 1972 was almost like Paul's way of saying, right, well, when the Beatles first started out, we had a producer, we had George Martin. Maybe that's the way we need to go with this album. You know, we'll bring in a producer, he'll give us some direction, and we'll maybe put something together that's a little bit more polished than Wildlife. But yeah, like Alan said, ultimately, you can't wind the clock back and undo everything you've done over that 10-year period with the Beatles and beyond. So yeah, it just didn't work out in the end.
Yeah,
Mm.
that's true.
Mm.
Just one more question. One thing that absolutely fascinated, well, many things that fascinated me about this book is there was such a dichotomy with Paul's personality that on the one hand, and stop me if you guys have already talked about this, but on the one hand, you know, you had this side of Paul that, you know, is very, you know, for lack of a better word, controlling. I mean, you know, he knows what he wants. He absolutely, you know, and of course, Denny Sywell and Henry McCullough, you know, would bristle under this, you know, saying this is what I want, this is how you play it, this is what I want. And then on the other hand, particularly before Band on the Run, you would have, well, the producers, as we just talked about, get frustrated with them because they would, you know, he and the band would get stoned in the studio and you know, would drink and that kind of thing. And so, you know, you would have this real you know, dichotomy, you know, this sort of personality split that, you know, on the one hand he would be so controlling, and on the other hand, you know, there were times when the producers clearly wanted to throttle him. You know,
I think it comes back to I think it comes back to a discussion we were having before you disappeared, actually, with Ken, which is that I don't think Paul really knew what he wanted Wings to be. So he had this conflict, you know, which was, you know, I was considered by George Harrison to be overbearing, you know, telling him that he can't play notes in between each phrase in Hey Jude, and, you know, all the other examples that we've heard over the years. So I think he's kind of, he's trying to hold back that element of his personality, and let Wings be a bit more loose and free. But at the same time, he can't hold back and control that element of his personality because it's part of who he is. It's part of his DNA and his artistic DNA. So, so yeah, I think that's why you end up like you say with this kind of dichotomy of control versus looseness.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be such a theme throughout, you know, one of the many themes, I should say, throughout the book. There's this duality of his personality. And and just one more thing, did you guys talk about Linda?
A little bit.
Okay, because I was just going to say another thing that fascinated me was her artistic growth that you really talk about, even just in this short period, through the book. I mean, how would you describe it, you know, just in these few years that you chronicle? You know, how would you characterize it, as, you know, how she grew as a, you know, a keyboard player and even as a songwriter?
As a songwriter, I guess she went from, you know, zero to Oriental Nightfish in the course of this book.
Yeah.
And the couple of things they did in Paris after the Band on the Run sessions were over. The fact that by the time this book is over, she's got maybe 4 songs, is something, you know. And as a keyboard player, you know, excuse me, it was a slow development, but, you know, by the end, I think she found her instrument in the Mini Moog. You know, those Moog lines on Band on the Run are her.
Yeah.
And she was very protective of them when they went to talk to Tony Visconti about orchestrations, and he proposed an idea for the intro of one of the songs where she had a synthesizer line. She said, "You're not covering my synthesizer line."
Yes. Yeah, that was a great moment.
So so you know, she did develop. You know, I don't think it's a startling amount of development, but it's definitely something. And you know, it shows that she did work hard at it, and she did take it seriously. And I mean, you have to. You're being thrown out there and on stage.
Yeah.
by your husband. You know, you have to do that, and I think she did. And you know, and also I was just watching One Hand Clapping today, and there are, you know, you see her playing the synth lines. And you know, going back to what we were talking about before, you see Jimmy McCulloch play note for note Henry's solo in My Love.
Right.
So yeah, I think she came along. I think her, you know, her greatest value in this part of the story is not so much as a musician who developed as you know, support for Paul in a way, you know, to be and he considers this part of songwriting collaboration, to have someone there who you trust, that you can say a few lines to and they'll tell you whether they're good or not, or maybe come up with a suggestion. That was Linda's role in some of their collaborative songwriting. You know, we have her own songwriting and we have the collaborative songwriting, which is very difficult to sort of pick apart what Linda's contributions were. Yeah, I think Linda, I think I said it before, she emerges as a really interesting character in this book. And I think we see a little bit more of her personality here than in any of the other books I've read.
Yes. I agree.
Yeah, one of the reviews of the book actually said it was the most balanced portrait of Linda that they'd ever read. So that was really flattering to read, you know, because we feel like we did represent Linda fairly, and you know, and looking forward to this film that they're working on at the moment, the Man on the Run film, you know, they said that's going to be an exploration of Paul and Linda's love story, you know, and I feel like our book, it does a lot of that, really. You know, it looks at their relationship and how their relationship affected his music. It affected his business interests. It affected every aspect of his life, you know. You know, Linda really, I think, is one of the heroes of this book, you know. And I think, as I said, I think other people have said something similar after they've read the book, that, you know, they were surprised just how brilliant that Linda, you know, came across in the book, how brilliantly, you know. So yeah, I find that, you know, really encouraging to hear when people say things like that, because I think she has had a bum rap over the years, and you know, I think we tell the story fairly and in a balanced way.
You know, there's one thing else I should mention, to bring it back to the very beginning of the conversation where we were talking about getting Paul to cooperate with us. I mean, we did try. Obviously, we wrote letters, you know, through all of his various addresses and managers and publicists. And one of the things that we said in the letter is, we want to show Linda fairly. We want to show her contribution. We want to show, you know, what she meant in all of this. And I think that he cannot look at the book and say, yeah, they didn't do what they said. We did what we said.
Absolutely. Well, and that's one of the many strengths of this book, is I think you present balanced portraits of Paul and Linda. And that's what I loved about this book. I mean, you really, as I said at the beginning, you presented three-dimensional portraits of them, and that's one of the many things I loved about this book. I know I speak for everybody here. I can't not thank you enough for being on the show. And I always ask this. I think I forget if it was a interviewer or a professor or somebody asked this of me years ago. So I always ask this of authors, which is, what do you want readers to walk away with after reading your book? What do you want to leave them with afterwards?
I think, yeah, fun. It's interesting. Yeah, again, I've had this conversation a couple of times, so I don't want to go over the same territory. But when we started work on the book, I had lunch with Mark Lewison, and because he lives not far away from me, he's a good friend of Alan's, and it was the first time I'd ever met Mark. And he said to me, he said, my one question for you is, what am I going to learn about Paul McCartney as a man from this book? And that always really stuck with me when we were writing it. And it's something that I give Alan a really hard time about, which is because and people will say, if you don't sit down with Paul McCartney to work on this book, how can you understand him? How can you understand what makes him tick? Emotionally and artistically. But I think that that's what we've managed to achieve with our book, is to really, give a portrait of all the different sides of Paul McCartney. And really, I think, anybody who picks up our book and puts it down and they haven't learned anything about Paul, then I'm happy to give them their money back, really.
Alan, how about you?
Yeah, what I want people to come away with really is a sense of how he did what he did, why his best stuff is so great, how it works, what its influences were, how he put it together in the studio, how why and also not even just the stuff that you thought was his great stuff coming into the book. I want readers to find things in the book that they didn't realize, were tracks worth listening to necessarily, because I mean, that happened for me writing it. I'm hoping it happens for people reading it.
Yeah, it sure did.
It did.
I've come up with a whole bunch of, absolute favorites of his from this period that I hadn't thought twice about before. Believe it or not, backseat of my car, which is now one of my favorite things from this period. I just thought was, it's an okay song, but, really looking closely at it and taking it apart and putting it back together and, writing the details really left me absolutely loving that song, and Little Lamb Dragonfly, and a whole bunch of other things. Even the Wildlife album, which was one of my least favorite Paul McCartney albums, I now have, I feel, a much greater appreciation for now that I know everything that went into it, including the circumstances leading to it. The fact that they had like 2 days of rehearsal and then went into the studio, and it's on one hand you can say, well, okay, Mumbo is is presented as live in the studio. It's not really live in the studio. All you need to do is listen to how many instruments you're hearing. There aren't that many Wings players, but the way they did it, I think, was brilliant, and so I now even have an appreciation for Wildlife that I didn't have before. So I'm hoping readers come away with that same experience in a way, looking at this period of Paul's life, song by song. We've done everything that he did, and come away with a few favorites that they didn't know would be their favorites.
I just want to interject that happened to me with Wildlife, with the song, Dear Friend, which I always understood and knew about, but I think I got an even bigger appreciation of Dear Friend from just the passages that I read in your book. And with the song Tomorrow, I didn't know, maybe many people do already, I didn't realize it had its roots as far back as May '69, just before the Abbey Road sessions, and that perhaps one of the reasons maybe it wasn't done or completed might be it was close, is kind of close to Don't Let Me Down in a way. I never drew that, comparison. I never thought about that, how similar that was.
Absolutely. This book will definitely make you rethink songs you thought you knew. you have to go out and get this book. If you don't have it already, this is an absolutely necessary addition to your library. Allan, Adrian, thank you so much for being on our show, and please come back when you have volume 2 out. And do you have any or yeah, 3, 4, all of them? Do you have any idea when volume 2 might be? I mean, just a general idea. I know you don't want to commit to a specific.
Will it be before Tune In, the next one? Volume?
Yeah. It will be.
Everything will be before Tune In.
Probably late 2024, and yeah, as far as we can tell.
Great.
We hope.
well,
speaking as 2 guys right now who are completely bogged down in volume 2.
yeah.
It's just, it's such a big, we're covering a slightly longer period in volume 2. It goes from 74, from the McGear sessions all the way to 1980. We're not going to tell you when in 1980, but in 1980. So it's a slightly longer period we're covering. And there's a lot that's going on during that time as well. You've got 2 more, or well, I suppose technically 3 more iterations of Wings during that time. Recording in just about every place around the world, Virgin Islands, New Orleans, LA, they're all over the place. It promises to be, just as good, if not better than volume 1. I don't know. I mean, there's just so much good stuff. There's so much good stuff.
And that'll take you till when? The end of the 70s, or?
Sometime.
Yeah.
In 1980.
Yeah. 80.
1980
We're not going to tell you when in 80.
He's not gonna
Leave us in suspense.
I think I know.
Yep. Well, we can't wait, and we'd love you to come back and talk about volume 2. And I promise I won't have power outages the next time. I'll talk to Commonwealth Edison and make sure. But thank you so much. Why don't you tell us where you can be found online, where you can be reached? Allan, why don't you go first?
Well, I have a couple of Facebook pages, Allan Kozinn and Allan Kozinn Remixed. We have a Facebook page for McCartney Legacy, and that's probably the easiest way to get to me.
Great. And Adrian, how about you?
Yeah, all of our contact information's on our website, which is themccartneylegacy.com, or just mccartneylegacy.com. And you'll find links to our Twitter and Facebook on there as well. We post, little updates regularly on Twitter and Facebook, together with some little tidbits of research now and again. Things that we found for the first book that we might not have used, or just little things that we're coming across during the making of the second book that people might find interesting.
Fantastic. And I will post those links in the description of this video. So make sure everybody checks that out. Okay, let's go around and just briefly let people know what we're up to. So before we do that, let me just briefly mention we are on Facebook, Talk More Talk. So please like us on there. We, of course, are right here on YouTube. Please subscribe to our channel and give us a thumbs up. You can also email us at talkmoresolotalk@gmail.com. You can find us on virtually any podcasting platform you can find. And you can follow us on Twitter, Talk More Talk, #1, just the #1. And you can find us on our website at talkmoretalk.com. And I don't have too much going on. If you're watching this today, Monday, February 6th, on Tuesday the 7th, I will be joining our good friend Ken Womack for Tuesday Night Record Club. We're going to be talking about Sly and the Family Stones, There's a Riot Going On, which I'm really looking forward to. Going to be really getting deep into the album, talking about it. And so I will post the link to where you can sign up for free to join us for the discussion on my Facebook page and the Talk More Talk page as well. So hope to see you there. So Joe, what's all going on with you?
Well, my channel on YouTube is Mean Mr. Mayo, and we're going to have some more Fab Gap shows in February dealing with solo Beatles stuff. There's also going to be a special 90th birthday show for Yoko. It's going to be 90 on the 18th. So please check that out. And also my movie channel. If anybody here is interested in movies, particularly horror, science fiction, but everything, my new channel name is Dial M for Mayo. So it took me a while. It took me 12 times to find one that I liked. And
you're sure this is it, right? You're sure that?
No, I like this one. I like this one a lot. I think I'll stick with it.
Excellent. Tom, how about you?
Well, February is looking to be a busy month for us at the Two Legs. The Queen herself is graced us with her presence on a very special episode dealing with. We'll hide this here. The missing '80s single. We won't give away the actual song, but we talk about why theories as to why it wasn't released, what we thought about it, and would it have been a hit. And then after that, we got Madeline Maccaro on. Talking about the Paul Yoko relationship throughout the years, and then we're going to have Glenn Greenberg on as well, talking about his new bookazine, the trivia book of the Beatles. Sorry, can't get but yeah, so it's going to be a fun-packed month for us over at Two Legs. So check us out, Two Legs Podcast on our YouTube channel. Email us at twolegspodcast@gmail.com if you want to suggest give us any show ideas. But other than that, we're just having a lot of fun talking about good old Paulie.
There you go. Always a good time. Ken, what's going on with you?
Well, first of all, for those of you, if you can't make it to see Kit and Ken tomorrow night, Denny Lane is actually performing in New York City at City Winery. So I just want all of you to know that since this is going up on the 6th, you still have time to see Denny Lane in concert. On my YouTube channel, I just had Tom and Adrian, and we did a Fab Five show. Yep. And a Fab Five show is when I asked my guests to name 5 albums, 1 Beatles, 1 from each solo Beatle, that are the albums that they're listening to at the moment, their go-to albums. And so Tom gave his list, and I've done that already with Joe. Kit, you're holding out on me.
Yep, I know. I will do it soon, I promise.
She's under contract with someone else, so she can't really do a contract with you because that'll interfere with But that's part of the McCartney legacy.
Okay. I'm also going to have Glenn Greenberg on Wednesday, I think. No, tomorrow. Tomorrow, yes. And so we'll be doing an interview about his bookazine of Beatles trivia. On my other podcast show, Things We Said Today, with Alan and Darren DeVivo, we're recording a show right after this because Alan is just a tireless person, works around the clock, 24 hours. If it's not his book, it's the podcast shows. That's it. And we're doing a show on your favorite Beatle cover versions of Beatles songs. So that'll be coming out probably tomorrow. And what else? My website, kenmichaelsradio.com. Actually, on Things We Said Today, we're also going to be doing a Yoko tribute show. That's going to be next week with several special guests on that. And my website, kenmichaelsradio.com, Beatles trivia every single week, where you can win the McCartney Legacy. Okay, there's trivia every week, starts every Monday, runs through Sunday. I pick a winner by Sunday night or Monday. I haven't gotten to do it yet. But I will have one up tonight anyway. But there's all different types of Beatle games and trivia questions on my trivia page, so be sure to check that out. And I think that's everything.
All right. Everybody's always busy.
Yep.
Never a dull moment. So Adrian, Alan, thank you again for being on the show. I know we could have easily gone another hour or more asking you so many questions about this incredible book. Again, The McCartney Legacy, Volume 1. Run, do not walk to pick this book up. It is just incredible. Thank you all. So from this zoo gang to you, thank you so much, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.